Constantinople, May 29th, 1453, just before dawn. The greatest city in Christendom is about to fall, and everyone knows it. For 7 weeks, Ottoman forces have been battering the Theodosian walls, fortifications that have stood for 1,000 years, that have turned back every army the ancient and medieval world could throw at them. But this morning is different. This morning the walls are coming down, and the weapon doing it isn't a battering ram or a siege tower or even Greek fire. It's a cannon. Not just any cannon, but a monster called the Basilica, a bronze beast over 27 feet long that fires stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. When it fires, the blast can be heard 10 miles away. When those massive stones hit the walls, they don't just chip away at ancient masonry. They pulverize it. They create breaches wide enough to march entire regiments through. The Byzantines repair the gaps at night, working desperately, but the next morning, the cannons fire again, and again, and again. By the time Sultan Mehmed II orders the final assault, sections of the wall that had stood for over a millennium are rubble. For thousands of years, the art of war was defined by the sword, the spear, and the shield. Castles and city walls could withstand sieges for years. Cavalry charges decided battles. Armored knights were almost invulnerable on the battlefield. Then a dark, dusty powder, seemingly insignificant, transformed everything. It wasn't the strength of a knight or the courage of infantry that would dominate future warfare, but the destructive power of a tiny grain of gunpowder that rewrote the rules of combat. How did something so small ignite an explosion that reshaped empires, toppled dynasties that had stood for centuries, and continues to echo in our modern world? This is the story of gunpowder, of the cannons that changed everything, and of the empires that rose to dominance because they mastered this terrible new technology.
Let's start with what warfare looked like before gunpowder, because you need to understand the old world to appreciate how completely gunpowder destroyed it. The medieval battlefield was dominated by 3 types of forces: heavy cavalry, infantry formations, and fortifications. If you were a king or a lord in medieval Europe, your military power came from armored knights on horseback. These weren't just soldiers. They were military aristocrats who'd trained from childhood in mounted combat, who could afford expensive armor and war horses, and who formed the shock troops that could smash through infantry lines. A charge of heavy cavalry was terrifying, hundreds of tons of horseflesh and steel crashing into enemy formations at a full gallop. Infantry mattered too, but they were usually second-class citizens on the battlefield. Pickmen, archers, crossbowmen, these were the common soldiers who held ground and supported the cavalry. Battles were often decided by cavalry charges, with infantry playing a supporting role. There were exceptions. English longbowmen at Crecy and Agincourt showed that well-trained infantry could defeat cavalry, but these were exceptions that proved the rule. Generally, if you wanted to win battles in the medieval period, you needed heavy cavalry. But the real power in medieval warfare wasn't even on the battlefield. It was in fortifications. Castles, city walls, fortified towns, these were the keys to controlling territory. A well-built castle could be held by a few dozen men against an army of thousands. Siege warfare was slow, expensive, and difficult. You could try to starve the defenders out, which might take months or years. You could try to build siege towers or use battering rams to break through walls, which required enormous resources and often failed. You could try to tunnel under walls and collapse them, which was dangerous and time-consuming. Or you could just give up and go home, which happened a lot. Medieval sieges often ended not with the attacker breaking in, but with political negotiations, disease, or the attacker running out of money and supplies. This meant that defensive structures were incredibly powerful. The Byzantine Empire's Theodosian walls protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. European castles could hold out indefinitely if they had supplies. The whole feudal system was built around this reality. Lords controlled castles, castles controlled territory, and nobody could challenge them without the ability to take those castles. Political power was literally built in stone. Military doctrine reflected this reality. Armies moved slowly because they had to bring siege equipment. Campaigns were planned around taking or defending fortified positions. The decisive moments in medieval wars often weren't battles but successful or failed sieges. Power belonged to those who could build and hold fortifications. That was the world before gunpowder, and gunpowder was about to make all of it obsolete. Gunpowder was invented in China, probably in the 9th century AD, though the exact date and inventor are uncertain. The Chinese were looking for an elixir of immortality, mixing sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter in various combinations, trying to create a substance that would grant eternal life. Instead, they created something that would kill more efficiently than anything humanity had yet devised. Early Chinese alchemists quickly realized this powder could burn explosively, and by the 10th century they were using it in warfare. But here's what's important. Early Chinese gunpowder weapons weren't cannons, they were fire lances. Basically bamboo tubes filled with gunpowder and projectiles that would shoot flames and shrapnel at close range. They were primitive bombs, ceramic or metal containers filled with gunpowder that could be thrown or catapulted at enemies. They were incendiary arrows and rockets. These weapons were terrifying and useful, but they weren't revolutionary. A fire lance had a range of maybe 3 to 5 meters. It could kill at close range, but so could a sword or spear. Early gunpowder weapons were psychological weapons more than decisive military technology. The Chinese gradually improved these weapons over centuries. By the 13th century, they had developed early cannons, bronze or iron tubes that could fire projectiles using gunpowder explosions. These early cannons were crude, dangerous to operate, inaccurate, and not particularly powerful. They were more useful for the noise and smoke they produced, which could terrify horses and demoralize enemies, than for their actual destructive capability. The Mongols encountered Chinese gunpowder weapons during their conquests and adopted them, spreading the technology westward. Gunpowder knowledge reached the Islamic world by the 13th century, and Europe by the 14th century. Initially, Europeans were skeptical. Why would you need these noisy, unreliable contraptions when you had perfectly good trebuchets and siege towers? Early European cannons, called bombards, were massive, immobile weapons that were as dangerous to their operators as to the enemy. They were made of wrought iron, essentially giant metal tubes that would sometimes explode when fired, killing everyone nearby. So, they fired stone balls that didn't always fly straight and had a reload time measured in hours, not minutes. They were expensive to make, required specialized knowledge to operate, and frequently didn't work. But there was potential. Because unlike a trebuchet that threw stones through mechanical advantage, or a battering ram that required men to push it, a cannon used explosive force. An explosive force could be scaled. Make a bigger cannon with more gunpowder, and you could throw a bigger projectile with more force. The physics were simple. A chemical explosion created gas expansion, which propelled a heavy object at high velocity. The engineering was what made it revolutionary. By the early 15th century, cannons had improved dramatically. Metallurgy advances meant cannon barrels could be cast in bronze, which was stronger and more reliable than wrought iron. Gunpowder formulas were refined, creating more consistent and powerful explosions. Cannon designs were optimized for different purposes. Long-range guns for bombarding fortifications, smaller guns for field battles, and everything in between. And people were starting to realize that cannons could do something no previous siege weapon could do: knock down stone walls quickly and efficiently. This is where we get back to Constantinople and the Basilica cannon. Sultan Mehmed II understood something that many contemporary rulers hadn't yet grasped. Cannons were the future of warfare, and whoever mastered cannon technology would dominate their enemies. When he decided to conquer Constantinople in 1453, he invested enormous resources in artillery. He hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban who cast that massive basilica cannon and dozens of smaller cannons. He assembled perhaps the largest artillery train ever seen at that point, maybe 70 cannons of various sizes. The siege began in April 1453. The Byzantines had about 7,000 defenders and the Theodosian walls, the formidable fortifications in the world. Mehmed had perhaps 80,000 to 150,000 troops and his cannons. Every day, the Ottoman artillery would bombard the walls. The basilica could only fire 7 times a day because the barrel had to cool between shots and the reloading process was so complex. But every shot mattered. Each 200-pound stone ball that hit the walls created damage that took the defenders all night to repair. The smaller cannons fired more frequently, keeping up a continuous bombardment that wore down both the walls and defender morale. For 6 weeks, this continued. The walls crumbled section by section. The defenders repaired gaps with wood and rubble, but these hasty repairs couldn't match the original construction. On May 29th, Mehmed launched the final assault. Ottoman troops poured through breaches in the wall that hadn't existed 7 weeks earlier. Constantinople, the city that had survived Arab sieges in the 7th and 8th centuries, Bulgar sieges in the 9th and 10th centuries, and Crusader attacks in the 13th century, fell in less than 2 months to an army equipped with cannons. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, was finished, and every ruler in Europe and the Middle East learned a lesson: walls were no longer enough. The age of the castle was over. The age of gunpowder had begun. The Ottomans didn't just use cannons, they integrated gunpowder weapons throughout their military. They equipped their elite Janissary infantry with arquebuses and later muskets, making them some of the first professional gunpowder infantry in the world. At the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, Ottoman forces under Selimai faced the Safavid Persian army under Shah Ismail. The Safavids had powerful cavalry, religious fervor, and numerical superiority. The Ottomans had cannons and musket-armed janissaries. They formed their wagons into a defensive fortification, positioned their artillery, and waited. When the Safavid cavalry charged, Ottoman cannons and muskets tore through them. The Safavids, fighting with traditional cavalry tactics, couldn't break the Ottoman defensive position. They were slaughtered. The Ottomans won decisively, conquered Tabriz, and established dominance over the region. This became a pattern. Armies equipped with effective gunpowder weapons defeated larger forces using traditional tactics. The technology wasn't just about firepower. It was about how gunpowder weapons changed battlefield dynamics. Cavalry charges, the dominant offensive tactic for centuries, became suicidal when facing massed musket fire and artillery. Fortifications that could hold out for years fell in weeks when bombarded by cannons. The entire structure of medieval warfare was being dismantled by chemistry and metallurgy. Three empires in particular used gunpowder weapons to build massive territorial states: the Ottomans in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the Safavids in Persia, and the Mughals in India. Historians call them the gunpowder empires, because gunpowder technology was central to their military success and political power. These weren't just armies that happened to use cannons. These were states that organized their entire military, economic, and administrative systems around gunpowder warfare. The Mughal Empire in India is a perfect example. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, was a descendant of Timur and Genghis Khan who'd been driven out of his ancestral lands in Central Asia. He controlled Kabul and Afghanistan and was looking to expand. In 1526, he invaded India with an army of maybe 15,000 men. He faced Ibrahim Lodi, the Sultan of Delhi, who commanded perhaps 100,000 troops and 2,000 war elephants. On paper, Babur was massively outnumbered and outmatched. He won anyway, at the Battle of Panipat, and he won because of gunpowder. Babur positioned his forces carefully, using wagons to create a defensive fortification. He placed his cannons and matchlock-armed infantry behind this barrier. When Ibrahim Lodi's massive army advanced, with war elephants leading the charge, Babur's artillery opened fire. The noise and smoke terrified the elephants, which panicked and stampeded back through their own forces. The cannons fired into the densely packed Indian army, each shot tearing through multiple ranks of soldiers. Babur's musket-armed troops fired volleys into the chaos. Ibrahim Lodi's forces, using traditional Indian military tactics, couldn't respond effectively. They were slaughtered. Ibrahim Lodi died in the battle, and Babur conquered the Delhi Sultanate, establishing the Mughal Empire that would dominate India for the next 3 centuries. Babur's victory wasn't about courage or tactical genius, though he had both. It was about technology and the tactical innovations that gunpowder enabled. By forming a defensive position with cannons and muskets, he'd created a killing zone that traditional cavalry and infantry couldn't penetrate. This became the standard Mughal tactic. Use artillery to break enemy formations, use musket fire to stop charges, and then use cavalry for pursuit. It was devastatingly effective. The Mughal Empire continued to invest in gunpowder technology. They developed sophisticated artillery forces, cast cannons locally, and imported the latest weapons from Europe and the Ottoman Empire. They built a military-industrial complex around gunpowder production, with state-controlled gunpowder mills and arsenals. Controlling gunpowder production became a key element of state power. If you controlled gunpowder, you controlled the army. If you controlled the army, you controlled the empire. The Safavid Empire in Persia followed a similar pattern. After their defeat at Chaldiran showed them the importance of gunpowder weapons, the Safavids invested heavily in artillery and firearms. They hired European and Ottoman experts to train their forces and build cannons. By the late 16th century, under Shah Abbas the Safavids had modernized their military, creating specialized artillery units and musket-armed infantry to complement their traditional cavalry. This allowed them to compete with the Ottomans and expand their territory. But gunpowder empires weren't just about conquest. They were about control. Cannons and muskets were expensive, required specialized knowledge to manufacture and operate, and needed constant supplies of gunpowder. This meant that only states with significant resources and centralized administration could maintain effective gunpowder armies. Local nobles or tribal leaders couldn't compete. A medieval baron could afford to equip himself as a knight and raise a small force of retainers, but he couldn't build a foundry to cast cannons or establish gunpowder mills. That required state-level organization and investment. This centralized military power in the hands of rulers who controlled gunpowder production and distribution. The Ottomans, Mughals, and Safavids all maintained state monopolies on gunpowder production. They established arsenals and armories under direct royal control. They recruited and trained specialized artillery and musket corps that were loyal to the central government, not to local aristocrats. This broke the power of the feudal military aristocracy. A noble with a castle and a few dozen armored knights couldn't defy a sultan who could bring siege cannons to reduce that castle to rubble in days. Gunpowder weapons also changed field battles. Early cannons were too heavy and immobile for field use, but by the 16th century, lighter field guns were being developed. These could be moved around the battlefield, positioned to support different parts of the line, and used to break up enemy formations before infantry or cavalry engaged. Artillery became a standard part of every major army. The introduction of effective muskets and arquebuses created a new dominant infantry type, musketeers. These weren't highly trained longbowmen who needed years of practice, or armored knights who required expensive equipment and lifelong training. These were ordinary men who could be trained to fire a musket in a few weeks. They weren't individually impressive soldiers, but massed musket fire was devastating. A volley of hundreds of muskets fired simultaneously could stop a cavalry charge or break an infantry formation. This led to new tactical formations. The Spanish Tercio, the Swedish Brigade, the Ottoman Tüfenkçi units, these were infantry formations designed around combining pikemen for defense with musketeers for firepower. Battles became more about discipline and coordination than individual heroism. Soldiers learned to fire in volleys, with ranks taking turns shooting and reloading to maintain continuous fire. Commanders learned to coordinate infantry, cavalry, and artillery to create combined arms tactics that were far more sophisticated than medieval warfare. The professionalization of armies followed. Medieval armies were often feudal levies, temporary forces raised for specific campaigns. Gunpowder armies needed professional soldiers who could maintain and operate complex weapons, who could execute complex drill movements under fire, who could be relied upon to hold formation when cannons were firing and muskets were volleying. The Ottoman janissaries, recruited as children and trained for life, were the model. European states gradually developed standing armies of professional soldiers, replacing the feudal levies and mercenary companies that had dominated medieval warfare. The impact on fortifications was equally revolutionary. Traditional medieval castles with high walls were vulnerable to cannon fire. The solution was the Tres Italienne, or star fort, a new type of fortification developed in Renaissance Italy. These forts had low, thick walls that could absorb cannon fire. They used angular bastions that eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to provide covering fire along the entire wall. They incorporated earthworks that absorbed cannon shot better than stone. Star forts could resist artillery bombardment that would reduce a medieval castle to rubble. But building star forts was expensive and required advanced engineering knowledge. This further centralized power, because only wealthy states could afford to build and maintain these new fortifications. The military revolution created by gunpowder made war more expensive, more technical, and more dependent on state resources. Small independent cities or local lords couldn't compete. The global impact was staggering. European states used gunpowder weapons to establish colonial empires. Spanish conquistadors with a few hundred musket and cannon-armed soldiers conquered the Aztec and Inca empires that numbered in the millions. Portuguese and Dutch traders used superior naval artillery to dominate Indian Ocean trade. The Ottoman Empire expanded into Europe, conquering the Balkans and threatening Vienna. The Mughal Empire unified most of the Indian subcontinent. The Safavids created a powerful Persian state. Russia used gunpowder weapons to expand across Siberia. Political boundaries were redrawn. Empires that adapted to gunpowder technology survived and expanded. States that failed to adopt it, like the Byzantine Empire, were conquered. The global balance of power shifted towards societies that could master gunpowder production, metallurgy, and the tactical innovations that gunpowder enabled. By 1700, the world's most powerful states were all gunpowder empires. The Ottomans, the Mughals, the Safavids, China under the Qing, and various European powers. The social impact was equally profound. The military aristocracy, knights and nobles whose power came from their personal military prowess and ability to afford armor and horses, lost their dominant position. They were replaced by professional officers who commanded artillery and musket-armed infantry. Political power became more centralized because only central governments could afford gunpowder armies. The feudal system, already declining, was dealt a death blow by gunpowder technology that made castles obsolete and created armies that only kings could afford. The legacy of the gunpowder revolution is all around us. Modern military technology, from rifles to artillery to missiles, all traces back to those first Chinese fire lances and crude bombards. The modern nation-state, with its standing armies and centralized control, emerged partly from the need to organize and finance gunpowder warfare. The global dominance of European powers from the 16th to 20th centuries was built on superior gunpowder technology and the industrial capacity to produce weapons at scale. The world we live in was shaped by the empires that rose to power through gunpowder. The gunpowder revolution shows how technology can completely overturn existing power structures. For thousands of years, warfare had been fairly stable. Tactics evolved, weapons improved incrementally, but the basic nature of combat, hand-to-hand fighting, and slow sieges remained constant. Then gunpowder changed everything in just a few centuries. It made centuries of military knowledge obsolete. It broke the power of the feudal aristocracy. It enabled the rise of massive empires. It killed millions and redrew the map of the world. And here's the thing. The people who invented gunpowder, those Chinese alchemists looking for immortality, had no idea what they'd created. They were looking for eternal life. Instead, they created a weapon that would kill more people than any previous human invention. The engineers who built the first bombards didn't know they were making medieval castles obsolete. The sultans and emperors who invested in cannons didn't realize they were creating the modern world. They just knew that gunpowder weapons won battles, and battles determined who ruled empires. That's the story of gunpowder. It's a story about how a dusty powder mixed from sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter changed everything. How bronze tubes belching fire and smoke brought down walls that had stood for a millennium. How the roar of cannons announced the end of one age and the beginning of another. How empires rose and fell based on who could cast the biggest guns and produce the most gunpowder. From the walls of Constantinople to the fields of Panipat, from Chinese fire lances to Ottoman supercannons, gunpowder reshaped warfare, politics, and the very nature of power. And the world we live in today, with its nation-states and professional armies and industrial warfare, is still living in the age that gunpowder created.